Firstly, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to the Alliance. It's great to see a collection of people working in trials coming together to see how we can do things better. And really, our presentation today is around that. Every now and again, we get the opportunity to stop running the trials that we do and actually look at the economics of trials and the efficiency in how we do our work. And what you'll see today is actually, unfortunately, in a lot of ways, we don't live up to our own mantra. And I say we as well. It's certainly not pointing fingers at anyone. We also suffer the same issues that we're going to raise today. But it is worth kind of thinking about them a little bit more. And as an economist, we always think about things in our weird economist ways. And so we're going to bring some of those learnings and some of those frameworks to the discussion today. As Bonnie's mentioned, I've got the wonderful Cade Schadbolt with me. He is very soon to be conferred PhD candidate who has really led and driven a lot of this work. So it's great to have you with us as well, Cade. I should say too that the work that we're presenting on today really is a broader collaborative team effort from a whole range of people at the Department of Surgery at University of Melbourne, including Michelle Dowsey and Peter Chung and others from other institutions as well. Thank the NHMRC for the funding and highlight to the audience some publications that we've written about this, should you be interested in some of the technical details. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to Cade to talk through some of the background context.
Thanks for that, Chris. So I'll start with some of the more general context around waste in medical research. On the right-hand side of the slide there, you'll see a kind of more detailed timeline of the key touch points in research and commentaries on research waste over the past couple of decades. But I think it really came to broader kind of public or academic interest in 1994, when Doug Altman, BMJ's long-standing chief statistical officer, claimed that medical research waste was a scandal in an editorial. It was a really influential piece of work, that editorial. In 2015, I think it was, the BMJ ran a poll to see what was the most influential piece of work that they'd published over the past 20 years. And that editorial, not another piece of research, despite the fact that they published such a large amount of kind of high quality research, that editorial was considered the most important publication over the previous 2 decades. Following on from that, in 2009, Chalmers et al. Came up with that kind of seminal statistic that 85% of medical research efforts are wasted. This is broken down a couple of different ways. Not all of them are summarized on this slide, but essentially 50% of trials never get published. 50% of the trials that do get published have the avoidable design flaws. And then another 50% of these kind of reported trials are reported so poorly or incompletely that they're almost entirely unusable. There's been a lot of work over the recent decades to try and raise attention and also address research waste. Probably the most prominent effort was the 5-part series in 2014 in The Lancet, which tried to address kind of each of the constituent parts of research waste that they thought could be addressed. Given that it's an economics audience, I think, I thought I'd mention the headline figure of about $85 billion a year is avoidably wasted on medical research. This estimate is based on data from 2009, so it's almost certainly a great deal more money being spent on wasted efforts at the moment. So I'll jump into some of the research that Chris and I have collaborated on alongside other people that are being a part of the project team. So the project that I led was looking at roughly 2,500 surgical trials that had been registered on clinicaltrials.gov between 2010 and 2015. We found, somewhat unsurprisingly, that about 1 in 5 studies had been discontinued, so they hadn't been finished after registration, and only 1 in 5 of them had been completed on time and met their target enrollment. On average, trials were delayed about a year based on their projected or their estimated duration. For me at least, one of the findings that I found slightly more interesting surrounded the trials that actually were discontinued. So on average, these trials had a target sample size of about 90 or so. And their sample size at discontinuation was far below that. So if you have access to the chat, it'd be great if you could put your best guess of how many people you thought they actually recruited.
So they were aiming for 90, and,
Yep.
and we're asking the audience to say how many did they actually get before they discontinued?
Yeah. Give you guys a couple of seconds to enter that in. See if I can access that on the other. We've got 10, 35, 55, 20, 20, another 20. Okay, I think the closest that we've got so far is from Slavica, who said 5. On average, they recruited only 7 participants. The slightly scarier aspect of that is they weren't trials that were discontinued a month or 2 in when they realized something went wrong. On average, these trials lasted exactly as long as they thought they were going to last. So essentially, they stopped recruiting and they stopped follow-up when they expected to stop follow-up, which is kind of worrying considering if you only recruit 7 patients on average, you should be aware that the trial is going to be futile or infeasible relatively early on. But it seems like the incentive structures just aren't there to get people to stop these trials early. There was another systematic review that was led by Sam Bunsley, and this was a slightly more focused take on this question. And our focus in this study was on placebo-controlled surgical trials, the so-called sham surgery trials. There were only 24 of these trials that were identified, and the sample was limited to studies that actually made it to publication. So these estimates are conservative or optimistic estimates. On average, or overall, only 13% of these trials reached their target sample size within their target time frame. So while all of these trials ended up publishing their results, even along this selective sample, they took a long time to get there. The scale of the underestimate of the overestimate of feasibility for these studies was also pretty large. So trialists on average underestimated how long it was going to take them to get one of these complex trials done by about 88%. And they also underestimated the number of trial sites at the outset. So they assumed that they'd be able to get it done with a couple of sites, and on average had to add more than a handful of these sites to get the study to completion. So that gives a bit of background, and now Chris can cover off on the kind of slightly more interesting mathsy aspect of it all.
Thanks, Cade. So really interesting research that was highlighting some of those gaps, some of those inefficiencies in research. And what we wanted to try and do in the next step was say, well, what are some of the economic implications of that? And one of the challenges is what's publicly available around those trials. And typically there might be a protocol, but protocols are planned, what we're hoping the trial is going to look like, not what it actually looks like. And what Cade's just highlighted is actually there's typically a big discrepancy between planned and actual. And so what we set out to do was really just create a very simple economic model that linked some of the key things around a trial together algebraically. So we were able to link recruitment to cost and duration. So a slower recruitment means higher costs and a longer trial. We're able to link algebraically eligibility and consenting rates and how they influence on the overall power that you're able to achieve with your trial. Able to link things around the number of sites that are required in your trial to the overall budget and the time, the duration of your trial. And so we put together that algebra, and the paper's got all of the algebra if ever you're interested. But what it let us do was basically say, well, if we've got some information about the trial, but not all of it, we can use that algebra, that simple economic model, to help us calculate some of those things that aren't publicly available. And so really that was the real aim for developing the model. And in thinking about it, it's also kind of interesting to think about the different types of economic problems that trials face, and really the optimization problem, once the trial's been funded, becomes what we'd call a power maximization problem. So we're trying to get the most power subject to the budget constraints, subject to the constraints which are typically budget and time. And so, with our given resources that we've been funded, with our given planned time for that trial, how can we try and optimize the power, the sample that we get. And really what the algebra highlighted, and it's, you know, it's just representative of trials in reality, but more sites equals faster, but typically extra costs associated with setting up a new site. Slower recruitment can be costlier, but also have a longer duration. So there's some interactions there. And what we saw in the work that Cade and Sam led with the systematic review shows that in reality, both constraints, both time and funding, can be what we'd call constraining, can be impacting on the ability for a trial to complete. And what we saw is that even kind of sham trials struggle to meet even one of these constraints. And so what we did, and well, I'll just walk you through a couple of graphs which highlight this in a little bit more detail. So this is what the simple framework looks like. On the y-axis, we've got the total costs of the trial. On the x-axis, we've got the duration of the trial. And the black curve is what we call an ISO power curve. So we're saying anywhere along that curve, the trial's generating the same amount of power. And so, for example, you could have a relatively low-cost trial with perhaps just 1 or 2 sites, so it's relatively low cost. But because it's only got 1 or 2 sites, it takes a long time. It takes 48 months to generate the recruited sample size that you're looking for to deliver your power for your trial. Alternatively, to deliver that same amount of power, you could do it differently. You could potentially have multiple sites. That can add some extra costs, but it means you can get things done a bit quicker. And so really what this framework is just highlighting is those trade-offs, that there are a whole lot of decisions that we as trialists make, you know, going forward when we're planning a trial, and then when we're reacting to perhaps actual events not being as good as what we hoped. And then the last slide is really just highlighting that in terms of this framework, as that curve moves out, it's highlighting less efficient trials. So in this case, the same trial taking 12 months, but a whole lot more costly to deliver that same amount of power. So a less efficient trial. And so the framework's really there to help us think through and quantify some of that waste that we've been highlighted in that initial context. So having built that framework, what we wanted to do was go and say, okay, well, let's apply this to some real world data. And that's why having those systematic reviews and that data that Cade and Sam had done was really helpful in terms of parameterizing the models. So what we did was take that information and we took those 3 categories of trial outcomes, so that there was one group that completed within the trial plan timeframes, but needed some extra sites to do that. There was another set of trials that completed but with an extension, so needed extra time. And then there was a third group of trials that didn't complete at all, so were incomplete. And we created a proxy for each of these with the data that was available, publicly available, and then we used the economic model to estimate actual planned outcomes, so planned costs, planned recruitment rates, rather than, sorry, I should say actual costs and actual recruitment rates rather than planned costs and recruitment rates. And so what we saw in that first group, that trials were completed, so that the black here in this graph is the planned and the red is the actual. And you see that, yes, the target budget constraint was about a bit over $1 million. Trial length was going to be 54 months with a target sample size of 70. The trial was able to achieve that, but it required extra sites to deliver on time, and that ended up requiring extra funding to deliver on that. The second group was slightly different. So those trials did complete in the end, so they did reach their actual or their target sample size of 130, but they needed more time and more funding because they needed more sites to deliver that sample. And then lastly, were incomplete trials that still use more funding. So they were targeting around 200, a sample size of around 200, but in actuality ended up only delivering 100. And even to get to that 100, they needed more budget than they'd originally planned. And so what we see when we tabulate the results across a range of different parameters and metrics, and if we look at two in particular, the total costs, that in kind of our best group, they were still, the actual costs were 50% higher than the planned total trial costs. In our next best group, those that completed but needed more time and more sites, they were 84% more costly than what they'd initially planned. And then in our incomplete group of trials, we estimate that they were, close to, well, over 200% more costly than what they'd originally planned, and yet they didn't even meet their target sample size. And in terms of really what was driving that and what we saw in the recruitment rates is really just a real misestimation of what was achievable in terms of recruitment. And so recruitment index is a metric for how many days it takes to generate one participant in your trial, one successful participant in your trial. And again, this group that completed the trials, even though those trials underestimated their recruitment index, they thought that they would need 230 days and actually needed close to 350. The trials that needed extra time and budget thought that they'd be able to recruit a patient every 17 days. It actually turned out to be 42 days. And when we look at those who were incomplete, this is where it really stands out. They really misestimated how long it would take to recruit a patient for their trial. They estimated essentially it would take 22 days in their planning, and on our calculations, it was actually taking 158 days. So really missing that recruitment rate. And interestingly, one of our key learnings from this too is that actually that recruitment rate, its interaction with the total cost of the trial isn't linear. It actually impacts through different mechanisms, both on your sample size and your power, but also on your cost side of things. And so it actually has a non-linear relationship with total costs. And so what you see is as the probability of patient consent gets lower and lower and lower, your costs increase, and they increase at an increasing rate. So it gets worse and worse and worse if you've underestimated or misestimated your probability of consent. And so really that was using some economic principles and a simple economic model to try and say, well, what have we learnt? What can we see about these trials that aren't able to deliver on time and on budget? And what does that mean in terms of waste? And essentially what we saw was that there was a really strong, and it's not surprising, it's very clear that there's a trade-off between time and money. And I think the COVID periods are another example of that, where time became so crucial that money was found and extra funding was found to progress trials really quickly. There's that non-linear relationship between cost and recruitment that I just showed you on the previous graph. And so that means that actually getting it wrong, if we get our estimates of recruitment wrong, it can be really costly. And so we saw, particularly with those trials that were incomplete, that they ended up really costing significantly more than they'd planned, and not delivering the value that we'd all hoped that would be generating from the trials. So that's really summing up from the economics perspective, but I'll pass over to Cade to talk a little bit more broadly around some of the learnings from this.
Yeah, so these are maybe implications, maybe questions. It'd be good to have a bit of a discussion with the group afterwards about what they think here. But we saw, roughly speaking, two different areas in which we thought there were implications for both Chris's model and the findings from the systematic reviews. The first is around trial design. So are there particular trial designs that allow us to get more information out of the same number of patients? And in so doing, they could potentially make these trials more efficient overall. The second one was looking at recruitment processes. As Chris said, there's a non-linear relationship between your recruitment rate and the costs of a trial. So even small or incremental improvements in recruitment processes are likely to save a lot of money. One of the things that's probably potentially obvious to the audience here is things like trial networks might be a really cost-effective and efficient way to improve or scale up recruitment. For funders, I think there's also some really important implications or questions. So first, that finding that I mentioned very early on in the talk about trials being discontinued despite the fact that you'd expect investigators to know that they were futile for most of the trial probably, was that we might want funding models that are able to incentivize fast failing, to have early milestones where people are willing to acknowledge my trial's not going to recruit as fast as we need it to get some information out of the study that we end up running. So we should stop early as opposed to late. The second one is that funders should have mechanisms in there to critically assess recruitment assumptions that are made as a part of clinical trials. Most of the feasibility work that gets done or gets worked into grant applications currently is kind of relatively unstructured and narrative, and it takes a little bit of disentangling. So it would be good to have some kind of formal metrics for how we can benchmark people's proposed recruitment rates against what we expect them to actually get. And the final one is that there should be some form of onus on trialists to show or demonstrate the feasibility of their recruitment, their proposed recruitment rates from the outset when they're seeking funding. One of the things that always strikes me is the fact that major funding bodies, at least in Australia, often seem to fund more large-scale trials than they do feasibility work. And you'd probably, from first principle, expect that to be the other way around, because you'd expect a lot of trials during the feasibility stage for us to figure out that the recruitment's not feasible or other aspects of the trial aren't feasible, so they shouldn't progress to a full trial.
And so we've focused predominantly, in some of this on in terms of the economics on the recruitment rate, but obviously there's a whole range of other things that are important to efficient trial research. I guess we pose it now to the Alliance and to the audience members. If you think waste in research is still a scandal, have we made some really significant improvements in terms of trying to get trials registered and published regardless of result? Are there things in your organisations, in your trials, where you think there's opportunities for improvement? So we look forward to a really fruitful discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. While we wait for people to think about your questions and get back to you, I'm going to just take the prerogative of the chairperson and kind of just start you off with one question. The first one is about whether there are and what incentives are there to continue a trial that's clearly not working, both within Australia and abroad, and whether or not you could comment on that.
Well, yeah, I think there's obviously a lot of complex incentives there. The one that always comes to mind first for me is the fact that oftentimes with trials that have funding for, say, 3 or 5 years, people probably feel some form of obligation to the staff that they've hired for these trials, as opposed to just for the patients. So if you're funded a research coordinator for a 3-year trial, and then 6 months in you say, we're going to give the funding back, the trial's not going to get there. I think there's those sorts of kind of interpersonal or professional incentives there. I think one of the other aspects there is people potentially aren't tracking the progress of their trials as well as they should be. One of the people in the chat, Kelly, has mentioned that they wonder how many of the trials that actually are futile or fail late, I guess, have genuine oversight from data safety monitoring boards or ethics committees. And I think that's another thing that hopefully we can improve over time as data safety monitoring boards come to the kind of forefront of most of these trials and become they're already the gold standard, but become common practice in these trials. You'd hope these independent bodies can pull the trials back or stop them early as soon as it becomes obvious that they're never going to get over the finish line.
I guess my reflections are absolutely there's some incentives, but it's really hard. Recruitment's really hard, and I'm sure the audience agrees. I've run trials and found exactly that, and so at least initially you're constantly trying to think, well, no, I can overcome this. The team, and we'll do this, and we could potentially add another site, etc. But ultimately, and what we've seen is too often actually it's futile and it's ending in low value care. And so we do, as a as a network and as a sector, need to kind of think through that a little bit more in advance.
I think it's one of those areas I'd hate to say, but we actually can learn quite a bit from pharmaceutical companies, because I remember many years ago, working at one, and they would celebrate little milestones about how many patients they recruited for clinical trials, and they would celebrate, individual clinicians, that how many patients they had individually recruited. So there's a lot of positive reinforcement, and yeah, that's really interesting. We do have some questions on the chat, so I'm going to go through them. One person has mentioned that surely it's an ethical issue for failing trials too. How many of these failed trials have genuine oversight from a data management board or an ethics committee? And I think, Cade, you kind of just spoke to that a little bit, but do you have any idea about how many trials did have oversight? Is that something you kind of looked at in your research?
No, it's not something that well, first and foremost, it definitely is an ethical issue. It was a nice piece by, I think it was by Deborah Zarin from the NIH, where she looked at consent documents that were on clinicaltrials.gov and how many of the consent documents mentioned the possibility that a trial might be stopped early. And oftentimes there was no mention of it. So when the trial ultimately did get stopped, if it did get stopped, patients could kind of expect to be a little bit blindsided there. As far as I can tell, there is no real way to identify whether these trials have a data safety monitoring board or really thorough oversight from an ethics committee. I guess for the more, if they make it through to publication, we might be able to look at protocols and if there's a mention of a data safety monitoring board there. But I think it'd be a really selective sample. So as far as I can tell, no, there's no clear way to figure that out in an unbiased way.
Yeah, I can see that. And I suppose the other thing is with patients, they're not, they're expecting to be able to access the treatment, even and they're expecting that it's going to be a groundbreaking treatment, because we're always sold that this is like a game changer, groundbreaking treatment. So yeah, and it's not always the case. That's why we do trials. All right, so next one. What about fixed or sunk costs? If these are large at the start of a trial, then it can be then maybe it's better to just keep going once you start to at least get some data, since so much money has been spent. So do you want to, I do notice the shape of the graph of those. So do you want to just talk about sunk or fixed costs?
That's a great question. And look, there are fixed costs in the model. And so we are able to account for that and kind of vary if they're bigger or smaller and see how that changes some of those trade-offs that we've gone through. But yes, ultimately, while I agree, it's probably some of that inertia that you feel, and the economist says it's sunk. But if you're still spending a whole lot of variable costs and your recruitment rates are at the level that we've seen in some of our research, there's not a lot of information you're getting from that. At least in a full trial sense, you could perhaps turn it into a feasibility study and try and get some learnings from it. Yeah, I'd still suggest that should be happening, even with the fixed costs.
And you'd probably think there should be some form of formal process there as well. I don't think people go through the formal process of, I've put or the funder or we've put all this money together to run this trial. There's all these sunk costs or fixed costs. We may as well get as much data out of it as we can. I don't think people are stopping and saying, for the amount of money we expect it's going to cost us to recruit an additional patient, are we getting value for money there? I don't think there's that much forethought oftentimes. I think people just take the inertia and keep going with it. So that's potentially attributing motivations to people, but that's the impression I get.
And I'm not realizing there's an opportunity cost to where that money could be spent otherwise. Yeah. Okay, Paul Scuffin asks, large multi-site trials can take months, if not years, to get through all the site-specific agreements, and I've certainly experienced that. There should be a single ethics committee that provides the oversight / approval for all sites. do wonder if individual sites would agree to that. Some are more difficult than others. It's a real problem for chief executives of hospitals to allow this, as they have responsibility for things that go wrong in their hospital. Yeah. Do you have any? I'm agreeing with that comment a lot. Do you guys have any comments on that? No.
Yeah,
I think I had a full agreement.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so Rachel Morden's asking or saying applicants overestimate the ability to recruit in grant applications. Site visit, well, I suppose it's part of a selling, it's part of their sell. Site feasibility assessments are optimistic. Cap funding and schemes and artificial durations, i.e. 5 years, are issues. Delaying contracts and governance prior to first recruitment. Risk aversion is also an issue.
Yeah. I agree. And one of the very basic, and I'll put my hand up and say it is very basic ideas that we've had as part of this. So it was that, wouldn't it be great where we could to have some kind of indication of what previous trials have done in terms of recruitment rates? So some kind of ready reckoner that might be able to look across the type of trial, type of disease, and get some ballparks for what's realistic, so that funders could actually say, well, are you within this range? And of course, a trialist could make a case if they're, suggesting that they can do things more efficiently. But there'd be an onus on, okay, actually highlighting that you're able to do better than what we've observed. I think it's even something as simple as that could add an extra layer of rigor to the way that we kind of evaluate whether or not recruitment rates are feasible.
I think another potentially oversimplifies things a little bit, but having funding agreements in place that are contingent. I think oftentimes now what you do is you give somebody 5 years worth of funding because they promised they do this trial in a grant application. If there was a 6 or a 12-month time point where you say, okay, we're going to reassess at that time point whether or not you've met your milestones or you've recruited to the rate that you thought you were going to recruit, that's it might be a heavy-handed approach to it, an oversimplistic one, but it might stop people from spending large amounts of money to recruit a handful of patients. With that money, there is an opportunity cost with that. It could be going to more efficient research.
Now, we do actually have Rachel on the line if she wanted to respond back to you both. Rachel, can you hear? Are you off mute?
Yes, yeah. Can you hear me? Thanks, Vivian.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Thanks, Bonnie. Yeah, Chris and Cade, this is just such a fantastic topic. So I co-direct a clinical trial centre, and we've got 260 staff and 100 trials at any one time. So this is just absolutely my daily quandary. More efficient running. So yeah, a couple of thoughts. I mean, I'd put a few things in the chat, but the only time I see NHMRC, for instance, have any power to come back to the investigators is when they request a no-cost extension. So big trials usually can't be finished in 5 years. That's sort of an artifact in terms of all of the analyses, including secondary analyses and cost effectiveness analyses, done in a 5-year time frame. So it's artificial. So what investigators do is they ask to spend the remaining money, if you like, in year 6 or year 7. And that's when the NHMRC can say, well, look, let's have a look and see how well you recruited in the first place, and we'll decide whether it's worthwhile allowing you more time to spend your envelope. MRFF does have some milestones, but I haven't seen much muscle flexed in terms of coming back to investigators. When you've got clinical trials networks and central coordinating centres, you're always able to, uplift staff and put them on other projects. There's always, lots of things. So you can efficiently manage staff. I think maybe where you're a smaller centre or you're just doing one trial and you might feel obligated to continue because you've employed the staff, that's possibly a little bit more of a risk. But I think a lot of the trials that Australian centres do, that's not a problem. But the one thing I would like to really pick up on is the issue with ICH GCP. And I think that model comes from investigational drug trials. And that represents, if you look at something like our registry, that represents less than 50% of the types of trials that Australians do. And that requires a whole lot of additional administration that's not required or relevant for at least half of the trials. And there is a movement to, you know, to have something lower than GCP. And I think that might help in terms of comparative effectiveness studies, pragmatic registry trials, implementation trials, where I think a lot of the delays, and Paul and a few others have mentioned these, are in the time to first patient on. And I'm not sure in your calculation of recruitments whether you did it from sort of, you know, first patient or time from when the funding was awarded, because there's often a year or two before the first patient, you know, is recruited. So I'd like to see a bit of risk sharing amongst countries as well, when you've got multi-country trials. And I think there's a lot that economists can add to, you know, to that sort of development. But yeah, look, I'm really interested if you're doing further work in, you know, sharing some of the stuff and data and efficiency targets or not that our centre achieves. Thanks.
No, amazing, and it does. I think it is really interesting to think through size and experience of our trial centres, and what we can learn, particularly for smaller sites. I think there's no doubt some improvements that we could be considered, and then more broadly, as you and some of the commenters in the text have highlighted, there's a whole range of things that I think the sector could continue to work on, and so. One of the things we are trying to do is to continue this research, just so that it isn't kind of a one-off every decade that we saw in the intro that Cade highlighted, but really an ongoing uplift in the sector, and that involves the funders and not just the trialists as well.
Yeah. I'm
gonna skip to the one of the questions at the bottom of the chat. So Tian Jiao talks about her experience in the pharmaceutical chemistry industry, and says that, and about waste there, and says actually they're not necessarily waste, because you can still learn from those experiences. That I just summarize that in one word, or very, very quickly. Do you want to kind of, and I think that kind of also comes to the point of publishing unsuccessful trials, and the inability to do so because the journals are not very interested in them. Do you want to just comment on that we can learn from those unsuccessful trials just as much as we can learn from the successful ones?
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to comment on that. So I think one of the real advances over the past decade or so has been that a lot of the clinical trials registration platforms now give you the opportunity to publish the results or post the results of a trial, even if it hasn't yet, or if it's yet to be published, which I think gets around a lot of that publication bias from the publisher's perspective. So you have a null finding for a trial, it might be difficult to get it published in a decent venue, but you still have the opportunity to post those results online. I'm not sure if it's a mandate in Australia, but I'm almost certain that it's a legal mandate in the US that if you're an NIH-funded trial, you are obligated to post your results to clinicaltrials.gov, regardless of what your findings are and regardless of whether you're able to get the study published in the end. So I think you can definitely learn a lot from trials that are unsuccessful insofar as they don't have a positive trial finding, if you want to call that unsuccessful. The trials that don't recruit much at all, that's where I think it might get a little bit more difficult to draw meaningful inferences from.
And there, what would be great is metadata that says you've also got to report not just your protocol, but also your actual. And it shouldn't be too difficult to, on completion of your trial, to actually provide that same metadata that you provided in your protocol, the basics, number of sites, your sample size, your budget, you know, some real standard metrics both before and then
Mhm.
actually what you achieved. And if that was routinely collected, imagine the insights that could be drawn from that.
And I think ANZ CTR probably does a better job of that than a lot of the other registries around the world, insofar as from memory they prompt people to upload how many patients they've recruited to date. I don't think I'm wrong about that. Whereas a lot of other registry platforms just get you to project what you want to recruit, and then when you're done, you upload your actual number, and those are the only two data points that we have access to. So I think those sorts of platforms have a lot of power in the space to give us the data that we need to really
learn from.
Yeah, exactly.
Fair enough. So another question that's been posed is about, and this is much more of a technical question, about how did you control for the COVID lockdowns? I myself was involved in several trials that were significantly delayed due to COVID lockdowns. It limited recruitment for face-to-face interventions, also focus groups, and attend some multidisciplinary team meetings. That's my experience. And with time-limited research funding, team needed to report, publish on the data that they had. Has this biased the results of your modelling?
Yeah, firstly, I ran a trial through COVID and experienced all of the challenges as well. Actually, our model proxies or the applications of our model were on trials before COVID, so we're from data from prior to that.
And the other aspect there as well is the trials that we were looking at in that initial cross-sectional study where we showed the high rates of discontinuation and slow recruitment. From memory, we only included studies from that were initiated between 2010 and 2014. So it was only those really long-standing trials that would have made it to the COVID lockdown periods there as well.
And just on why we actually went back a long time is we're trying to give trials as long as we could to actually see them complete or not.
Yeah, fair enough. And then I think we're just gonna I've got one last question that's in here, I think, is like, so we have stopping rules currently already preset for efficacy and safety. Should there be stopping rules for recruitment, and how would we best identify what those thresholds should be?
Good question. And without that data of seeing plan versus actual, it's hard. But I would have thought that you could absolutely come up with some kind of threshold limits where you say, as a sector, yes, and as a funder, unless we see X%, or that you're on track, that that would be some kind of indicator of triggering a stop clause. That's always going to be debated, but until you put that in, then we end up with what we see today. So
I wonder if it's something that, like, the expected value of sample information could help inform.
Absolutely. I should have added too that our model didn't include that. That was going to be a next step, but it was one we haven't got to yet. It'd be great to have that, that expected value on the other side of the coin.
At the moment, I don't think we've got some comments about the ANZ CTR, but I don't think we've got any key questions, other questions for you in the chat at the moment. Do you have any final concluding remarks that you'd like to mention? Any key points that you felt like you need to make?
Nothing from me other than we absolutely love people to reach out. If you've got any ideas or want to continue the discussion, we're always very happy to do that. And Cade's continuing to do some great work in this area. So if anyone wants to collaborate on some of that, we'd be very open to that. And thanks again for the opportunity to present and discuss.
All right, thank you. Well, this is our last seminar for the year. So thank you very much to everyone who has attended the multiple seminars. They are available online to download if someone you knew was not able to attend. I've certainly downloaded and listened to some of them in the past. And we are planning on the seminars for 2025, but I just want to just do a quick flag out that you will be invited to do complete a post-webinar survey, and it would be highly appreciative if you complete that, and that might help our planning for next year. And without further ado, I think I might call it the end.